The House will now have under consideration House Bill 62. Good lady from District 28.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would ask unanimous consent to dispense with further reading of House Bill 62.
You've all heard the unanimous consent request. Is there an objection? Hearing none, the good lady has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and representatives. I appreciate the opportunity to bring House Bill 62 to the floor. I know that as a leader, we shouldn't be looking for tax exemptions. However, in this case, I felt it was necessary to request this exemption to level the playing field for pregnancy resource clinics here in Idaho. Currently, these facilities compete with the Government Health Department, as well as a nonprofit organization that receives a third of their funding from federal tax revenues. This is not about creating a new class for a limited segment of our population, but rather an opportunity to level the playing field a little. I would also like to speak to the fiscal impact found on House Bill 62. We listed $10,000 as the fiscal impact to the state of Idaho. However, I would like to note that this is a worst-case scenario. First and foremost, these pregnancy resource clinics receive most of their supplies and needed equipment and so forth to provide their services through donations. Secondly, the few incidental purchases that they do need to make generate a tax liability of approximately $200 a year. On a rare occasion, you may see that they have a large purchase, such as an ultrasound machine, and that would tabulate up to about an $3,700 tax liability. Let's say that 2 of these 5 facilities in the state decided to buy an ultrasound machine at the same time. We'd be looking at roughly $7,400 for that one-time purchase, and another 7 to 10 years before those purchases would be needed again. If you take that combined with the $200 times 5 clinics, you're talking about $8,400 to the state in that instance. We rounded up to $10,000 for good measure to make sure we weren't missing something, and so that we could be fair to the state. But I would also like to note that in many ways, and in fact I think most importantly, these facilities actually save the state thousands of dollars because of the services that they provide. They provide free medical services to girls and young women that find themselves in a very scary situation, an unsure situation. And those situations may actually end up in emergency rooms and other facilities, either on a Medicaid basis, indigent care, or CAT fund revenue stream line. And therefore, this small exemption allows these resource clinics to stay open and provide services that save us thousands of dollars every year, and I'd like that to be noted. The House Bill 62 passed out of committee with a do-pass recommendation, and I would ask for a green light here on the floor. Thank you.
Is there further debate? The gentleman from District 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to Rule 38, I'd like to divulge that I am a chairman of a crisis pregnancy care center in northern Idaho, and I will be voting. Thank you.
Duly noted. Good lady from District
19.
19.
Will the lady from District 28 yield to a question?
Will the good lady from District 28 yield to a question?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'll yield.
The lady yields.
Mr. Speaker, good lady. I have a little bit of concern about the definition of a pregnancy care clinic. As somebody who's pregnant presently, I don't see an actual definition. Has there been any thought into how that definition would apply to maybe other clinics other than the one that you're representing?
Lady from 28.
Mr. Speaker, good lady from District 19. Yes, actually in the definition that we put into the statute itself, it says that the pregnancy resource clinic must be recognized by the IRS as a 501c3, therefore has IRS recognized status as nonprofit. They also must have a licensed physician on staff to help protect the services, those people that they will be providing services to. And then the final definition that we added is that it would be limited to those facilities that do not terminate life at their clinics.
Good lady from 19.
Mr. Speaker, permission to debate?
The lady has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I understand the need and the intent of this legislation, but I have a concern about the lack of definition for pregnancy resource clinic. I think I'm speaking directly to other 501c3 organizations such as midwifery clinics that could possibly apply for this tax exemption. And so I have a little bit of discomfort with the fiscal note. I'm not sure if $10,000 will be what we're actually talking about. So I would suggest that this legislation have a sunset date so that we're able to look at what the actual fiscal impact is of this legislation. So I will be voting no on this legislation.
Is there further debate? Good gentleman from District 19.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd just like to mention two other things about how this is written in terms of an exemption. As the good lady from 19 mentioned, it isn't clearly defined as to what a pregnancy resource clinic is, which leads many people to think that the fiscal note is not accurate. But secondly, this does not preclude organizations from having discussions about abortions and referring them to places that actually do perform abortions. The other piece is, in the case of an ectopic pregnancy, where the woman has had a fertilized egg plant itself in the fallopian tube of the woman, and a tubal abortion is necessary for medical purposes, it precludes organizations that would be willing to do that. So while from a general perspective, and I have to say I applaud the good lady from 28, it's very hard to stand up and debate against a bill when you just did such a wonderful, beautiful job at singing. But while this does something to speak to what would be considered optional pregnancy termination, to some degree, for medical pregnancy terminations, in the case of ectopic pregnancies or the life of the mother, it actually kind of changes the whole field. And so as a result of that, I'll be voting no.
Is there further debate? Good gentleman from District 23.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to comment back to the objections, there's nothing that would stop them from bringing an RS and doing in that RS what they're talking about. This is good legislation, and they have the opportunity to do that. Thank you.
Is there further debate? Here, good gentleman from District 21.
Thank you, Chairman. I rise to debate.
The gentleman has the floor.
I was concerned on a couple of points on this bill and spent some time looking at it. The one point is simply the bad tax policy to pick and choose these kinds of things. However, I do notice in the existing legislation there are dozens of pick and choosers in there, and if later on we want to have better tax policy and do things differently, I'm certainly open to that. I was also concerned with perhaps issues of equal protection and due process. And so I actually took this to the Attorney General for an opinion and received an opinion back from him, and he was quite satisfied that there were no issues in that regard. And so from a point of view of leveling the playing field, of at least fitting in with other tax exemptions that are less important than this one, perhaps, and also the idea that this was not a violation of equal protection, I've decided that I'd be supporting this bill. Thank you.
Is there further debate? Good gentleman from District 16.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have concerns with this bill because of the tax policy issues, and also because of what I regard as the discriminatory issues with respect to clinics that do provide termination of pregnancy services. With respect to the tax policy issues, the way I understand this bill generated from what we were told in committee is the owner of one of these pregnancy resource clinics believed that when goods were purchased by the clinic for use in the clinic, that they were not subject to sales tax, found out that she was incorrect about that, and ultimately had a bill of perhaps some $6,000 to pay because of that sales tax obligation. I don't think that the taxpayer being mistaken in that regard is really a good basis for changing our tax policy. The other thing is that this bill is pretty narrow. The testimony in committee, if I recall correctly, was that it will affect about 5 clinics statewide. Now, we've heard debate today that suggests it may be more than that because of the definitional issue, but just for the moment, accepting that it's about 5 clinics statewide, we're creating an exemption in our sales tax law for 5 organizations. And those 5 organizations, let's assume for the moment, are worthy of this exemption. There are many other organizations that are also worthy of an exemption. Clinics that deal with the mentally ill, those who deal with suicide issues, those who deal with things like Alzheimer's and diabetes and diet and nutrition. All of these kinds of clinics are, in my estimation, equally worthy of this kind of an exemption. And the issue becomes, obviously, you get to a point where this becomes very broad. We can all point to many, many, many organizations that we think should be exempt from this sales tax obligation. So how broad do we want to make it? Do we want to say that every 501c3 in the state of Idaho will be exempt from sales tax obligations? There are private schools. There are many organizations that all of us could feel are very worthy. So I think we're backing our way into a policy because somebody got caught up in a mistake. And rather than getting out in front and looking at what the policy ought to be and how it ought to affect everyone. Finally, the provision on termination of pregnancy, those clinics that provide that service not being eligible. As those of you who have served with me for the last couple of 3 sessions know, I am pro-choice. I view this as being very discriminatory towards clinics that provide that kind of service. As the good gentleman from 19 pointed out, there are medical reasons why pregnancy terminations need to occur to save the life of the mother in some situations, and there are other circumstances. And I do not think that as a matter of tax policy, we ought to essentially be making a decision on the abortion issue. So for all of those reasons, I will be voting no. Thank you.
The Speaker would take a moment to remind the members of the House and all those in the House that the provisions of Rule 70 have not been relaxed. Therefore, food and drink is prohibited. Is there further debate? Hearing none, the good lady from District 28 is recognized to close debate.
Thank you. In closing, I'd like to speak to a couple of the points that have been made. First, I want to clarify that the clinic that brought this to my attention and that started the ball rolling, so to speak, was under the assumption that they were sales tax exempt because they were already recognized as a nonprofit organization and because they were a health-related entity. And both of those have been previously discussed in this noble body as exempt, receiving exempt status in different forms. Therefore, because of that, she did think that their clinic was tax exempt. When they were audited, when they purchased an ultrasound machine that created a high enough tax revenue liability that it was brought to the tax commission's attention, she actually asked those questions. It was clarified that the statute did not allow for that, she would have to be added, that their organization would have to be recognized as an exemption in order for her to receive those. They quickly paid the sales tax liability and any penalties, have always filed their other tax forms, necessary forms, and have paid any other fees that have been required of them. This was not a nefarious deed on their part, and they have since then purchased many things that are considered high-ticket items and have paid those sales tax. But the point is that that little amount of money to the state creates a huge concern for them as they try to provide these services for these young women. And yes, I agree. I wrestled with some of the same issues that have been mentioned here today in that we are creating another tax exemption under a code that was written long ago. And finally, what allowed me to come to grips with it and to be able to move forward is a couple of things. First and foremost, a precedent has been set in this noble body, as many others have brought their situations on a case-by-case basis, and they have been granted or not granted, as you have seen fit, to receive those tax exemptions. And this is another case in point, exactly like those that have already been visited. I agree that we may, as a body, need to take an overriding look at the current tax policy and decide if we're going to take a huge step and do a blanket nonprofit exemption or not. But until that date, this is the precedence that's been set, and we need to continue taking a look at them on a case-by-case basis. And finally, for me, it came down to truly leveling the playing field for these organizations and facilities. They already compete with a nonprofit organization that does provide the abortion option for mothers and receives a third of their funding from federal tax revenues. And also, just as to speak to the good gentleman from 19's point, with the concern of the mother's life, I would agree that there are times when an abortion is not only justifiable but necessary. And in that case, that is very much so the issue. And in talking with those from this clinic and others that provide these same services, they have protocol in place to provide for that very thing. The reason that they went into business was to protect these girls, these young women, in all cases, including those when the mother's life may be in danger, and they do have protocol in place to take care of those. Our concern with opening it up to other organizations that maybe don't have a more myopic view on that situation is that only about 1%, if that, of abortions within the United States come down to the life of the mother or the other case that we feel is justifiable, and that is the case when the young woman's been a victim of a sexual crime. All other abortions simply come down to, well, let me put it this way. You said that many of you have said you're pro-choice, and I am too in many ways, but for me the choice should be made at or before conceptions, not at an abortion clinic door. And therefore, until the law is maybe remediated to such standard, I personally am not going to come here as a proponent of that particular service. Thank you.
Debate is closed. The question is, shall House Bill 62 pass the House? The clerk will unlock the machine and the members will cast their votes. Have all the members voted? Does any member wish to change his vote? The clerk will lock the machine and record the roll. The roll call shows 58 aye, 12 nay. House Bill 62 has passed the House. Is there correction to title? Hearing none, House Bill 62 will be transmitted to the Senate.